Welcome to the, I believe, 28th in a series of webinars organized by Jewish Voice for Peace. Um, this is the Health Advisory Council of JVP. My name is Phil Brewer. I'll be the moderator of today's program. Dr. Noga Shalev will be the co-moderator. In these programs, we invite expert guests to discuss important topics having to do with health and healthcare in Palestine, including Gaza, the occupied territories, and the West and East Jerusalem. We encourage you to visit our website at jvphealth.org for information and registration for future webinars. Our guest today is Alexander Smith, who will discuss the topic of crimes of deprivation and the rule of law. Alex will speak for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, after which we will round out the hour with a question and answer period. Dr. Shalev and I will ask the first questions, followed by questions from the audience. You may submit your questions by typing them into the chat for queuing by Dr. Shalev, or time permitting, you may ask the question directly. The total time of the presentation will be approximately 60 minutes, and I will now introduce our speaker. Alexander Smith is a lawyer with a background in global health, human rights, and international humanitarian law. He studied law and public health at Northeastern and Tufts universities and dedicated 23 years of his career to health and human rights work, including in Afghanistan, Jordan, Sudan, West Africa, Southeast Asia, the Balkans, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Alex was a senior advisor with USAID on gender, maternal health, child health, and nutrition for 4 years, but resigned last year, as he will explain in his presentation. He has since been on CNN, Al Jazeera, and multiple academic and interagency forums on the urgent need to prevent the crime of starvation in Gaza. He establishes the case in an upcoming article on Israel's culpability in violating the fourth item in the list of 5 which constitute the crime of genocide. Alexander, we're very grateful to you for your willingness to share your knowledge and experience with us in this matter, particularly on the same day as the national hands-off demonstrations. It actually couldn't be at a better time, I think. So the floor is yours.
Unmute. Hello. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thanks to Phil and Noga and Alice and the whole team for organizing this talk. I'm always very happy to talk to folks who are interested in these topics. And especially on, as Phil said, on a day when you could be out at large protests. I appreciate people showing up for this exchange, and I do want it to be an exchange where everyone asks a lot of questions and we have a good back and forth and talk about some of these issues that I'm gonna bring up. Great. So as Phil said, I have worked in global health and human rights for about 23 years, 24 years, including with US and UN agencies. I also did a stint in The Hague with the ICC and the ICTY. And I have a connection to Palestine, to the West Bank, in that when I was 23, decided to go and experience what was happening there. I went and volunteered with a group called ISM. I grew up in Maine, not really knowing any Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims until I was probably about 18 years old. But in college, I started meeting different people and really took an interest in Middle East studies, reading Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmad and thinkers of that ilk. And then rather spontaneously at 2021, I moved to Pakistan for my last semester of college, working alongside UNHCR and making a documentary film about Afghan refugees. This was 2020, I'm sorry, 2001. So this was about 4 or 5 months before 9/11, and everything in that region changed very quickly. Um, but that experience of first working in Pakistan and then later Afghanistan and Jordan and many Arab and Muslim countries, that ex all those experiences cumulatively gave me the very strong, I want to say belief, but more of an acknowledgement that, of course, all people are people, that all the really stupid movies I grew up with in the 80s were inaccurate, that people in Pakistan don't want to take my head off. They were very friendly, and everyone wanted to buy me cups of tea and hear my life story. So that was my sort of upbringing. Then later in 2003, I went to the West Bank, volunteering with ISM. This was around the time that Rachel Corrie, who was my same age then, was killed in Gaza. Um, it's the same organization that Ayşenur Ezgi Egi was volunteering with when she was shot last September. So obviously those experiences stuck with me, and I've always had a very warm spot for every Palestinian family that I've met and stayed with and eaten with. Um, so I decided to include in a presentation in February of last year, um, an element of international humanitarian law and why it's wrong to target health systems, to target ambulances, and to make life unlivable and more dangerous with worse health outcomes for people. Um, this was very similar to presentations that I'd done at USAID before. Um, Earlier that year, I'd done one on Nepal and another one on Zambia, talking about some of the policies that lead to poor health outcomes and how those could be mitigated. So I came up with this new presentation on maternal and child health in Gaza, and it went through 3 tiers of checks within USAID and a contracting agency. And it was approved to my surprise. I was actually quite impressed with USAID as an agency that they were going to, in a conference of our own staff and a few implementing partners, just talk about Gaza, talk about the uh, data that we had from before this conflict, and then what we could expect from other conflicts around the world where we see many more deaths from starvation, disease, than we do from bombs and bullets. So that was going to be the gist of the presentation, but then come May, when the conference was actually on, the day before I was meant to present, I was told that I would not be talking about Palestinian human rights or maternal child health outcomes in Gaza. And it wasn't a total shock given the leadership at the time, Samantha Power, who had written several books on genocide, all of which I've read because I had been a huge fan of hers, was the head of USAID and decided not to talk about the man-made famine. She acknowledged that there was a famine, but didn't talk about the causes of the famine or the human rights abuses, which is something that we would certainly talk about with other countries in Ukraine, for example. So it wasn't a total shock that the presentation was abruptly canceled. What was even more shocking was that before it was canceled, I was told to remove certain words like Palestine and actually given a 2-column sheet of newspeak, so to speak, of approved words and words that I should not say. I was also told to remove an accurate map of Gaza because it was accurate, because it showed very clearly the borders and the sea borders of Gaza. Um, so that happened, and then the next day after that, I was told by my contracting company, because we're most of the staff are private contractors, as you know, that I was definitely going to be terminated, but that I had the option of resigning instead. I spoke to my office that I actually worked for, Global Health and Maternal Child Health and Nutrition, and they were quite eager to keep me on, but I decided that this was my time to leave. So I penned a very quick resignation letter and sent it out to Samantha Power's office and explain that I can't do my job in a setting where some people are considered people and some people are not, depending on their race or religion or ethnicity. And then shortly after that, the Guardian newspaper picked up my story, and then my resignation letter was published in the Independent. And since then, been doing a lot of speaking on exactly the same issues that I was prevented from talking about. It's the great irony that in preventing me from talking at a conference where maybe 40 people would have attended, instead I gave the same presentation to Al Jazeera and talked about it on CNN. Um, so that's funny how that worked out in a way. But yeah, since then I've been working on some very exciting new research. This is really what I wanted to talk about today. One is a body of research that I'll be pursuing with York University here in the UK. Um, and that is on the crimes of deprivation, what I was saying about the use of starvation, disease, destroying water facility treatment plants, that sort of thing. Um, as opposed to the other more obvious and clear forms of violence that tend to end up on the news. Starvation certainly gets less media coverage than bombings. And then the other article that I have coming out shortly that I want to talk about is on the new Trump doctrine of foreign aid, where aid is no longer a lifeline, but a ultimatum. Even now, aid is used as a bargaining chip, or even worse, as a deadly weapon, forcing countries to make catastrophic concessions, perhaps compromising human rights, ceding exploitation of natural resources, and or aligning with unethical political and corporate interests along those lines. So the Trump doctrine also threatens to destabilize fragile regions and transform humanitarian aid into a powerful tool to a tool of coercion. And that could have far-reaching implications for global health security and global security and ethics and human rights. So first, I wanted to talk about the York University crimes of deprivation research. This is going to be with the School of Law. So as you know, my background is in public health and law. So it's very much a law focus, but also using evidence to support these cases through public health research. Um, so the basic gist of the research proposal is that the existing of framework of international law, questioning whether it is able to hold parties accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Some people term these crimes of international concern, when the repertoire of violence is primarily starvation, disease, destruction of health and sanitation, and other forms of deprivation that don't match that popular imagination of what crimes against humanity are. Um, is it possible for a state with enormous geopolitical standing to commit these types of crimes under a guise of a humanitarian disaster and essentially hide evidence of actions and intent and block fact finding and ultimately escape accountability? So I would be applying a analytical legal framework, looking at definitions and comparable legal precedents. One line of reasoning is that Israel's actions in Gaza violate international humanitarian law and international criminal law, including, as Phil mentioned, the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute of the ICC. Lastly, the current framework of international law, is it capable of holding parties accountable for these specific acts? Or will legal frameworks need to adapt to this new reality? One example of how international humanitarian law has adapted before was with the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, when at that time it was obvious that a lot of warfare was going to be asymmetric going forward. It's not always going to be big countries fighting each other, but could be small militant groups within countries struggling for one cause or another. And so international law was adapted then to understand this new reality and be able to react to it and hold people accountable. So the gist of this research is also to answer that question. Are there new standards that need to be applied to see whether international humanitarian law can counter and deal with these types of crimes? Um, and then getting into the research itself, I've published a couple of papers already on crimes of deprivation, especially in maternal and child health and nutrition, starvation, but also really looking at maternal and child health in the context of the prevention of births. The Genocide Convention names through Articles A, B, and C, killing, inflicting mental harm, creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And that's where starvation would likely fit in. But there's a fourth part of that, Article 2D, that deals directly with prevention of births within a group and looking through the legal background of how that's been defined and interpreted over the years. That can be a very broad category. It could be acts like forced movement of people, forced migration, dispossession, when genders are separated, such as the case of Srebrenica, when mental harm is inflicted with the goal of making procreation more difficult, as was the case in Rwanda, with some of the sexual violence that happened there. Um, and also, the ICC has specific guidance on the question of prevention of births within a group. So the beginnings of a legal framework are there, but I think there would be new laws and policies that would be need to be adapted to try to deal with what specifically has been going on now, in the sense that we've seen birth become much more dangerous. Whether or not that was the intent, that is the outcome. And it's quite easy to prove also that there is intent to do that. Um, a lot of the statements, as you know, made by Israeli leadership about no uninvolved civilians, about Amalek, are later parroted by Israeli IDF troops on the ground in Gaza and captured on video. Literally, soldiers dancing in a circle about Amalek and the fact that there are no uninvolved civilians. That kind of straight line between the statements of an official and statements of soldiers committing crimes on the ground is exactly something that courts have accepted previously as evidence of intent. Um, there are more examples of that are done through actions, for example, targeting water and sanitation, targeting maternal health wings of hospitals, cutting off electricity to a NICU. That these are all very specific acts that were carried out with a specific intent to prevent births within the group. Um, Within the research, there's also a large branch on whether third parties have an obligation to prevent these types of crimes. There is precedent in the ICJ, uh, meaning that if a country knew or should have normally learned of serious attacks of genocide, that they have an obligation, even if their withdrawal of support isn't likely to have an effect, they still have an obligation to withdraw that support. And that same obligation was brought up in the ICJ's case, specifically dealing with the occupation in July of last year, talking about the responsibility of third parties not to contribute to the continuation of the occupation. Um, so one could argue that the legal frameworks are there; they're just being carelessly violated in full view. In which case, you have to then ask the somewhat semantic question: is it because the laws as they exist are sufficient but violated, or are they insufficient as they are? So that's what the majority of the York research will be about. Another article that I have coming out soon is on the Trump foreign aid doctrine. And I mentioned this is a doctrine that's rooted in everything being transactional, but really worse than that, we're talking about a Trump administration that could force countries to violate human rights norms in order to get life-saving aid in the future. And we have already seen examples of this. One that I think really flew under the radar in 2018 was when um, Trump suspended a half of a payment to UNRWA, the same United Nations agency that had its funding banned in January of 2024. Back when UNRWA used to have quite bipartisan support, Trump suspended half of the aid shipment, cut it from 100 something to 60 something. And that was done very clearly with the goal of, it was communicated to the Palestinian leadership that that cut was due to them needing to revisit peace talks without the right of return. So that was an example of holding aid on the condition that a government give up one of its human rights. The right of return can't be erased through unilateral action by the Palestinian Authority. It's enshrined in UN General Assembly resolutions and international law. But the attempt was there anyway back in 2018. Um, so this is it's a very new form of attack. The article also gets into the more general attack on USAID. I spent 4 years in USAID's Global Health Bureau, and at that time warned my colleagues that it was possible that exactly this attack could happen. There was one specific attack in 2023 from a far-right fringe element led by Matt Gaetz to defund USAID because USAID had a lot of programs that dealt with gender and gender identity, and there were definitions of gender that included non-binary and LGBTQ populations. So back in 23, again, there was foreshadowing of what was to come. But I obviously really didn't think that the agency that I'd worked for and that had been going strong since 1961 for 65 years could be completely destroyed so quickly. That really came as a shock to all of us. The most surreal part was really the experience of watching two men, Musk and Trump, who honestly haven't the first clue what humanitarian aid is and how it works, them justifying their catastrophic decision with these bizarre claims, like the most famous, the 50 million condom shipment to Hamas, $50 million worth of condoms. While I had my own criticisms of USAID leadership, and those are all in my letter of resignation, I really wanted to make it painfully obvious that the agency as a whole is or was a force for enormous good, and that the Trump Musk characterization of USAID simply had no basis in reality. And then I go through in the article about some of the startling statistics about, an estimated 11.7 million lives and 2.1 billion malaria cases prevented through the Presidential Malaria Initiative, which was started by George W. Bush, further underlining the fact that USAID used to have very solid bipartisan support in the concept of saving lives for its own sake. Meanwhile, the AIDS PEPFAR program has saved even more lives. The office that I used to work for, the Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health and Nutrition Office, could claim over the course of a decade to have enabled 40 million women to give birth in health facilities with skilled birth attendants, to have reached another 33 million newborns with post-delivery care, and to have trained 14 million health workers in maternal and child health and nutrition. Doing enormous good. The really important thing to mention here is that in MCHN, maternal child health and nutrition, the decisions about who we were going to help were purely non-political. So this is the complete opposite of the new Trump doctrine. With our limited funds in MCHN, 25 priority countries were selected, but they were based on where maternal mortality figures were highest, obviously. Um, And secondly, where our interventions could have the most impact, factoring in existing facilities, infrastructure, conflict, and security. The aim here was to avoid putting USAID funds into areas where our programs couldn't be effective. So this is why Somalia and Chad were not in that list of 25 priority countries, despite having very high maternal mortality ratios and child health outcomes being very dire. So it's important to underline that never once in this process was a country's government or trade status or any other political factor taken into account. We never, asked, do we like their government? Does our government like their government? Making our assessments. And a case in point, more than 3.7 billion of US aid money was delivered to Afghanistan after the Taliban seized power in 2021. The Taliban are obviously not a US ally, but the Afghan people continued to need and receive life-saving aid for maternal and child health outcomes. Also, a massive amount of food aid. One other project that I worked on directly, now canceled, sought to end polio in Afghanistan through screening and widespread vaccination. This was all done through UN agencies for the most part. But makes that point that, it was never about alliances. It was never about transaction. It was just about saving lives. In the global health part of USAID, there were other parts of USAID that were more affected by politics. Um, and then, it was is given all the facts and figures that I just talked about, it was really hard to watch Elon Musk refer to this entire agency as a bowl of worms. He was thinking he'd made a really clever point on a Twitter Spaces interview when he said that USAID was not an apple with a worm in it, but a bowl of worms. Uh, and then, it was really hard to watch the justification of the decision to destroy USAID with what I mentioned, the $50 million worth of condoms directly to Hamas, which they used to make bombs somehow. That claim first came from Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. The following day, Trump repeated that and literally doubled down. He claimed that it was actually $100 million for condoms to Hamas. This despite the fact that USA does not provide or fund any condom purchases in the Middle East region. We haven't for the last at least 4 years, as far as I know. Despite the fact that USAID worldwide has bought roughly 1.7 million in condoms for the entire world. And that mostly goes to countries in Africa to prevent HIV. But they made sort of a last-ditch effort to avoid looking foolish, and the Trump appointed State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce claimed in writing that 102 million for condoms was prevented from reaching the International Medical Corps, IMC. Now, IMC did have programs in Gaza, but they were field hospitals. They had nothing to do with reproductive health or condoms. But that group, IMC, was defunded so that Trump could save face. So that was really hard to watch. Um, and I also mentioned some of the creation of fraud of waste in what Trump was doing. I think it was pretty widely covered in the news, but when USAID was shut down, uh, a lot of the food aid that was going to go out to Sudan and to a lot of famines and emergencies didn't reach the people they were meant to get to, which was obscene in itself. But it also meant that shipments of in-kind food aid were delayed, and some of it is perishable, and amounted to about 489 million worth of food assistance just sitting in ports, running the risk of spoilage. So that's a massive waste as a consequence of trying to quote unquote prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. The USAID IG Inspector General uh, made a point of saying that that waste was happening, and also reported that the counterterrorism vetting unit supporting humanitarian assistance had been told not to report for work because staff had been furloughed. And thus, there could not be any vetting of partners, and that gap left USAID susceptible to inadvertently funding entities or the salaries of individuals associated with terrorist organizations or other criminal organizations. Um, Trump's reaction to that IG report was to fire the inspector general the next day with no reason given. I do want to also mention, and it's mentioned in the article, that the Biden administration was far from perfect in moral terms. As you know, I had my issue with the administration talking about human rights when it was human rights violations against an ally and not otherwise. But there were other policies. There was the time-honored practice of in-kind food aid that I mentioned, going to countries from American farmers. It's a hugely inefficient process. It would be much better to send cash or support local agriculture. That would be a much more cost-efficient and sustainable way of doing food aid. That's not Biden's fault, but that's something that Congress has mandated for many years. Um, but there were, massive amounts of aid going through U.S. aid to Ukraine, adding up to about 16 million, where the next closest was Ethiopia, getting about 1.2 million, 1.8 million rather. Um, so I wanted to make that point that the Biden administration certainly wasn't perfect, but they didn't do what's happening now, using aid in a very bald way, um, as a transactional thing to force countries to comply with U.S. Policies that could violate human rights. Um, so other examples of the Trump doctrine, you may recall in the news when Trump announced that he was going to empty Gaza of Palestinian people. Um, at first, he was saying we're going to take it, and that would not be a voluntary movement of people. Since then, it's gone back and forth. Sometimes they talk about it as voluntary, sometimes not. But you may recall when that idea first came out about forcibly displacing 2 million Palestinians to Egypt or Jordan. Trump very explicitly threatened Egypt and Jordan uh, with complete blocking of their aid, amounting to 1.5 billion for Egypt and 1.7 billion for Jordan. Um, and also perhaps disrupting the 45-year-long peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, because aid is unofficially part of that agreement. Um, and another example I mentioned, the UNRWA case where half of the shipment was withheld so that the Palestinian leadership would give up the right of return. We've also seen with the deportation of individuals to El Salvador, where the U.S. has been sending thousands of alleged gang members, despite federal judges issuing orders to halt the flights. Um, we've seen about 6 million annually go to El Salvador to help run the detention centers, like the infamous one, the terrorism confinement center, um, where there are widespread reports of insufficient nutrition, unsanitary environments, and widespread abuse and torture. So that torture is conditioned on doing what the U.S. wants and then getting money in return, getting aid in return. Um, and we've seen the example with Ukraine as well, where significant concessions were forced upon Ukraine in the form of the exploitation of natural resources, half of Ukraine's mineral wealth, in order to continue receiving military and non-military aid. Um, so it's a scary prospect, but once established, this could become something that becomes Republican doctrine, in the same way that many issues that used to have bipartisan understanding have shifted to the right. Or we may see, as with the funding for UNFPA and the global gag rule funding for NGOs that provide abortion, we might see it come and go with Democratic administrations and then go back with Republican administrations. Um, and that's a scary prospect for the future. We don't know what kind of world that will lead to. We could see um, uh, situations where countries are forced to, for example, vote against Palestinian statehood in the General Assembly and could make a country ineligible for aid if they vote that way. We could also see, predictably, it's quite plausible that the administration could, given their animosity towards the International Criminal Court, require that countries can't be eligible unless they withdraw from the Rome Statute, that sort of thing, as we've seen with the administration's very effective threat to defund Columbia University domestically. Countries receiving aid may be required to outlaw and crush leftist or populist political movements or protests or other forms of dissent. So those are all the plausible scenarios I'm talking about in the article. Um, and then I try to end on a positive note, talking about the inherent flaw in the rolling out of the Trump doctrine. It might lead to its downfall, even having already preemptively abolished aid and forced countries to find new donors and set up emergency funding by other means. The threat of denying that aid is no longer a bargaining chip. If Trump succeeds in alienating allies and foes and erasing, those 65 years of good trade relations and humanitarian goodwill, the U.S. may really find itself isolated, needing the rest of the world more than the rest of the world needs the US. Uh, and that's a bad thing for the United States. It's not necessarily a bad thing for the world, for developing countries to learn to live without the US as a reliable partner. In fact, the sooner they do that, likely the better, given that this is unlikely to stop with Trump. As I say, this could become a cycle of being extremely unreliable and a changing face of what foreign aid doctrine is. Good. So I will go ahead and stop there. I'd love to open it up to questions and yeah, have more of a discussion.
Thank you so much. I'll start with the first question. And it has to do with the subject of malnutrition.
Mhm.
And aside from the short-term deaths that are directly attributable to malnutrition, one thing that doesn't get discussed very much, but which you discuss in your paper from last December, um, there's the long-term effects of malnutrition, the lack of zinc, vitamin A, and other nutrients in people who survive this will still have a permanent effect on their neurological development, just as we're seeing the effects of um, the education of our children because of the closure of schools during the year, more or less, of the COVID epidemic, and we're still catching up on that. The children in Gaza um, will never catch up because they will have permanent neurological effects, vision, IQ, etc. Um, it's just it's an observation as much as a question, but I figure
Yeah.
you might have some more
Yeah.
comments about that.
It's a
And, and then
real, yeah.
and then and I do have a practical question that you and that is one of the things you also mentioned is one of the important elements of getting food and humanitarian supplies is to have distribution hubs.
Mhm.
And my question is, what happens when an order comes down from the Israeli army, such as the most recent one, that all of Rafah has to be evacuated? What happens to those distribution hubs? The trucks aren't there anymore.
Mhm.
Um, or is there anything left there to distribute? So,
Yeah.
all right.
Great. Yeah, and a lot of those distribution hubs and warehouses were targeted as well. That was part of the Human Rights Watch report all the way back in December of 2023. They were talking about that very specific targeting of hubs, warehouses, agricultural land, already then ringing the alarm bell that this use of starvation as a war crime was already underway. And it wasn't really a secret because Yoav Gallant said that he was going to do it. It's very unusual, in my experience in The Hague, that individuals announce their intent to commit these kinds of crimes so publicly. But yeah, going back to your other observation about starvation, I'm a real fan of Alex Duvall and his work. He teaches at Tufts University. Him and Tom Dannenbaum are really the world's leaders in terms of this issue of starvation in conflict and starvation as a war crime. And teach courses. When I was at Tufts, there was a great course on nutrition and complex emergencies, how to respond to exactly these kinds of emergencies when there isn't a blockade. Um, what should happen in terms of getting aid to people. But Alex Duvall, he's always a big fan of saying that starvation is like a speeding train, and that when you hit the brakes, it's going to keep going for quite a while down the road, in terms of the long-term health effects. As you mentioned, cognitive decline, eyesight, stunting, physical growth, and heart conditions are likely to plague the entire generation of Gaza's children as they get older. They'll be more at risk for the double burden of obesity as well. Um,
Mm.
and that's even goes on for multiple generations. There's multiple studies from China, Bangladesh, and the Netherlands during World War II, the Dutch hunger, of the babies who were in utero when that starvation happened, and the worse health outcomes that they had as they got older, mainly cardiovascular health. Um, but also the China and Bangladesh studies showing that the starvation of Chinese people and Bangladesh led to the next generation of people being more at risk for some of those same poor health outcomes, cardiovascular mainly, and obesity.
Mm. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Noga now, who will conduct the next part of the program, the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Phil, and thanks so much, Alex, for a thought-provoking and insightful discussion. We have some very interesting questions from the audience that I will start reading and condense by theme. We have a couple of questions about international humanitarian law. So Mariam asks, Alex, if I understood your upcoming research correctly, looking at the scope of international humanitarian law and adapting that scope to apply to local militant slash armed resistance groups, this seems very interesting. These groups are often labeled terrorist organizations, whether they be the Tamil Tigers or others. What is the current legal framework around this?
Yeah, so it's something we kind of learn in international criminal law day one is that there is no agreed upon convention or definition of terrorism in international law. There are illegal acts, there are crimes against civilian populations, things that were committed by individuals in Hamas on October 7th certainly could fall into that category. Any attack on a civilian. But there is no framework in international law for labeling one group of people as terrorists. That's just a political term that's applied. If I'm being cynical, it's applied by the US to dehumanize any population that we'd like to exterminate or inflict harm on. So yeah, there is such a thing in international criminal law as a act of terror. There were people at the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, who were convicted on committing acts of terror in terms of inflicting mental harm on a population as well as committing other crimes. But yeah, that's a good point to raise. I'm looking at her question. I did mention local militant armed resistance organizations in the context of the 77 protocols to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions were adapted to understand this new reality in the 70s, that people were realizing that, most conflicts were not going to be World War II, state against state. There were going to be armed uprisings and civil wars and asymmetric warfare. So in the same way that the laws were changed in the 70s, my research is going to seek to try to understand what laws could prevent what we are seeing now, if any laws can prevent what we're seeing now.
To follow up directly on that skepticism you just expressed, Alice Rothschild asks, what is the power of international humanitarian law if it is ignored by countries committing human rights violations? Is there any kind of enforcement besides goodwill?
Yeah, the short answer is no. International law is really, Francesca Albanese talks about it being on a knife's edge. We might see from this point on the complete unraveling of IHL. Um, it's just an example of that. Hungary just invited Netanyahu to visit, and he was on the ground there this week. Despite the fact that Hungary was a member of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but they withdrew so that Netanyahu could come without any fear of being arrested and taken to The Hague. So that's not a good sign that countries are doing that. Generally, though, I would say that within Europe, the signs are good that there is going to try to be an adherence to international law. And one data point on that is the UN General Assembly resolution that enforces that ICJ decision that I mentioned before. Not the genocide case, but the case that came out in the decision that came out in July, describing the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as illegal, saying that all the settlements would need to be dismantled and removed, saying that reparations were due to the Palestinian people, which wasn't mentioned in the judgment, but I would assume that would be the GDP of Israel many times over. And also talked about the responsibility I mentioned of third states not to give any aid that supports the illegal occupation. When that decision by the ICJ came out in July, I got very little news coverage in the US, certainly, and not a lot here either. But in September of last year, a very large majority of countries voted in the General Assembly to enforce that decision. And what was particularly interesting was Europe, where several countries that have never voted for Palestinian statehood did respect that ICJ decision. Out of 20 countries, I think only two, Hungary and one other, voted against the resolution. There were many abstentions, like Germany, but it was a pretty significant shift in Europe of countries wanting to call the occupation illegal, which is quite a significant thing. Yeah.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience about what people can do. I'm going to hold those questions to the end so we can end on a note of hope and action. But we have another excellent question from Mariam. On a more urgent note, let's talk about the current aid embargo into Gaza that has now gone on for more than a month. Is there anything that can be done on an urgent basis, any legal humanitarian mechanism that can be utilized to urgently get people in Gaza food, water, polio vaccines, and so forth?
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer for that, but no, I mean, one, I can't really call it a positive shift, is that this is being done in full view. There's no longer a pretense that Israel isn't starving Gaza. They're just saying we're going to do it. We're going to starve Gaza, and they are doing it, which again won't make any difference in the US, but within Europe, that's not going to go down well, that they're doing it very publicly. It's going to be hard for European leaders to pretend that they aren't seeing it, and they are still beholden to their populations. Here in Britain, there's a very strong populist movement in support of Palestine, and one way or another, politicians are going to eventually either get voted out or otherwise have to take notice of that. So, and we did see quite a few MPs who were running on Gaza get elected in this last election. But as far as what we can do in the short term, yeah, there's really not very much. The only sort of hope is that more countries step up and recognize that this is a blatant war crime. If Europe was to cut off their trade relations with Israel, that is a third of their economy, and that would make a difference and could perhaps end the embargo. Um, but it's a question of political will. I wish there was more we could do.
Thank you for that sober assessment. A related follow-up question from Hina Zafir. Apologize if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. Hina asked, do you think that Gaza represents an opportunity for a new international humanitarian law framework, one whose powers are not limited by the United States?
This is what I hope to discover in this research with York University. It's going to be really hard to define what sorts of changes would um, make a difference. One, sort of pie in the sky idea is that when uh, food is cut off, when famine is being forced upon a population, that would automatically trigger something within the United Nations where there needs to be sanctions on that country immediately without any real debate. If a country just obviously says we are going to starve this population, that would trigger something. But yeah, my hope is that in the next 5, 10 years, that there is a change. And one thing that I look at as sort of a hopeful sign is that it did take from the first bill in the United States Congress sanctioning South Africa, from that first proposal of a bill, similar to what Bernie Sanders has proposed that only got 15 votes in the Senate this last time, to stop arms to Israel. From the first bill, to the end of apartheid took about 17, 18 years. So we might be in for a very long haul, but eventually that arc of justice does bend towards, the arc of history bends towards justice.
Thank you for that. Shifting gears a bit, Moore Mizell asks an epidemiological question and its relationship to human rights, humanitarian law, rather. Do we know how many babies were born in Gaza since October 2023? And how does the continuous birth support the fact of starvation, genocide, etc.? Can you speak about the time frame of starvation versus women being able to carry to full term? I think maybe
Yeah.
this is a bit of a challenge to you can you prove really that Israel is preventing births in Gaza, and how can you do so?
Yeah. I would encourage folks to read the full article that I wrote on this on Article 2D of the Genocide Convention, which gets into a lot of this minutia about the very direct effects that displacement, starvation, and other forms of deprivation have on um, pregnant women, but also newborns. I believe it's about 50,000 per year or 60,000 per year. When there wasn't a war, we have a lot of data on the pre-war conditions. So I would assume, that it will be a bit less because there would be, a tripling of the miscarriage rate and a lot higher maternal mortality from the three main causes, bleeding, infection, and preeclampsia, all of which are exacerbated by the conflict, as well as the ability to screen for and treat those three main killers of women in childbirth. The ability to treat those is also severely diminished by the lack of supplies and drugs to treat those conditions. So that is sort of one way you can see what sort of effect Israel has had on the birth rate is through the pre-war birth rate and looking at today. But yeah, again, the severe causes of maternal mortality, bleeding, preeclampsia, and infection will be exacerbated by things like cutting off the water supply, by starving people, when women are denied protein-rich foods, they become much more susceptible to bleeding out, dying from bleeding during pregnancy due to anemia. So preventing birthing kits, preventing those specific drugs, the osteotoxics to treat those conditions, that those would be acts that are very intentionally designed to prevent births.
So I have my own follow-up question as an epidemiologist. You spoke earlier about the Biden's administration culpability and lack of more moral clarity around this issue. One of the most painful moments for me was very early on in the war on Gaza, when the Biden administration essentially denied the ability of Palestinians in Gaza to report data on mortality and morbidity. And I want to ask you if there's any move to make the erasure of people's ability to collect data on their own annihilation part of a way of documenting genocide.
Well, it's certainly a way of trying to obscure genocide. I was at a conference here at Cambridge talking about exactly the data collection issue and how AI has been used in the conflict so far in terms of targeting individuals or not targeting, but just indiscriminately killing. And yeah, one of the big concerns is that Palestinians will not be allowed to collect data, but also that all of the heaps of data that must exist in Israel about everyone who has been targeted and casualty figures and all of the photographic evidence that will, of course, be destroyed and never seen in a court. So yeah, it would go both ways. But I think, yeah, undercutting the credibility of data collected by the Gaza Ministry of Health, because Hamas is the government. So that Ministry of Health is technically Hamas run, but it's just health officials who are collecting data. I was in the article that I'm writing about the Genocide Convention. I was joined by a co-author who's a wonderful researcher here at Cambridge, and she's written. She was part of the Lancet article that described in February of this year that the death toll is very predictably at least 64,000 as of January 30th of last year. So the period of October 7th to January 30th, 2024 was at least 64,000 based on their model and collecting data and cross-referencing that with obituaries with other data sources. And I really respect her work because she's trying very hard to be accurate. Last September, I was approached by Ralph Nader's folks who wanted to put out a press release that the death toll was upwards of 300,000. And I'm not quite sure where that claim would come from, which is not to say that it's wrong. The death toll could well be well over 150,000. Even up to 300,000, but I haven't seen evidence to show that. So,
Mhm. Alice asks an additional question. What is the response of Arab countries and the global South to the genocide?
yeah, I haven't lived in that region since the genocide started. But one of our co-resignees, Hala, who's an amazing individual, was working for the State Department as a Foreign Service officer in Jordan, and she talks quite a bit about the reaction there. That much like Britain, much like the United States today, they're seeing massive protests, and that the majority of people are very much against the genocide, understandably. As you know, Jordan has a huge Palestinian population from the people displaced in 48 and 67. And throughout much of the Arab world, that's the same case. And I'm not sure. I'm not enough of a Middle East expert to really say much about how much political pressure, populist pressure it would take for those governments to change course and want to do more. At least cut ties to Israel and ask other countries to do the same. Um, so yeah, I don't really know, but there's some anecdotal evidence that it's across the world a populist thing for populations to be anti-genocide and for the leadership not to be.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? You can also raise your hand or unmute. It doesn't have to go through the chat if you'd rather have a direct conversation. Unmuted. While you're waiting for people to think of questions, there were a number of requests from the participants for advice on what to do. What can the average person do? Where can we donate money to help organizations on the ground? What are your recommendations in those domains?
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had more good advice or things that I think would be effective. I think, people still need to write the op-eds. They need to get out on the streets with signs, like today. Yes, Phil just put in the chat that Medical Aid for Palestine MAP is a wonderful organization with very little overhead that does great work in Palestine. Yes, yeah. But yeah, I think, everybody speaking out and making it very clear. I heard a wonderful interview with it was the Yale professor who's just recently moved to Canada as a reaction to all of the shifts. She's a professor of Slavic studies, but also does I think Jewish history and studies around authoritarianism. And she was talking about how in this moment, with the deportations from universities, with that sort of thing, yeah, that nothing would make Trump happier than seeing people who are out protesting and very pro-Palestinian human rights to, blame Jewish people for what's happening on university campuses or what's happening generally in the world. Nothing would make them happier than to play those both sides against each other, to have people who care deeply about human rights turn on Jewish people. I don't think that's going to happen because it has been so obvious up to this point that many of the leaders of the protests are Jewish. But I expect that they will keep trying to drive that wedge and try to make that animosity happen. You're still muted.
And on a more positive note, anything that you can foresee in the future in terms of legal development, either in the United States blocking some of the Trump doctrine that you have discussed, or internationally?
Yeah. So far the court cases around U.S. aid haven't been very significant in terms of destroying U.S. aid as a entity. The first court case that was won, I believe, just put a hold on some of the personnel decisions. The staff who were let go had certain rights, but it didn't restore the full funding of U.S. aid. Um, I don't think. I think that honestly, it's going to come down to the Supreme Court, and I think that John Roberts has very clearly signaled that he is going to try to avoid a conflict by saying that Trump isn't in any way violating the law. When it comes down to it, his priority is to try to legitimize the court and try to stay relevant. And the only way to do that, if Trump is blatantly breaking the law left and right, is to say that Trump isn't breaking the law left and right. So that's pretty much all I expect from the judicial branch.
Okay. So hard to get you to be optimistic, Alex, but we understand
Yes.
the context.
Yeah.
Mariam, on the other hand, wants to remind us that someone had mentioned activism and opinion within Arab states, but there seems to be increasing civil action in Israel as well. One organization I can think of is Standing Together. I don't know, Mariam, if you, it isn't a question, but a thought on civil action in Israel. Thank you. I'm
Sorry,
aware.
it wasn't a question. I'm so sorry. I should just, I just wanted to get sort of people's thoughts on it, on civil action within Israel, because I think that's, I don't know, I'm personally just a little bit frustrated, especially on particularly the aid topic, because there seems to be such an urgency there. And as Alex mentioned, things like in South Africa, for example, it did take, well over a decade, almost 2 decades, but we are seeing new military weaponry. We are seeing, I'm not sure the population is going to last that long, to be frank. So it was just a question of, I was just thinking about anything that could be done more urgently to tap into the frustration that I think most human beings feel.
Thank you, Mariam, for that clarification. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I really don't know. That's a really good question. I'm going to the West Bank in Israel in July, so hopefully I will be able to come back with a better answer about the civil society groups and what they can do and what activist groups can do to try to put pressure on the government to get aid in, or at least stop the current round of violence. But I really don't know at this point.
We'll just flag from our own knowledge of our collaborations with Israeli civil society counterparts, Physicians for Human Rights. Israel has consistently condemned the blockage of aid to Gaza and more, and they've done more. And other non-medically affiliated groups, such as Standing Together, have been very proactive in getting outside opinion into the Israeli mainstream, and perhaps we'll have some traction. Mo has put in some comments. Mo, do you want to explain what you mean by people look over your shoulder when you watch videos with the sound on? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that.
Hi. I mean that until now, I've been watching the videos coming out of Gaza and I watch everything. I've been watching it at bus stops while I wait for the train, on the train, and I take the sound off because I'm in Israel. And I don't want to cause, a ruckus, but I've had it and I'm done like not taking that risk. And now I recently decided I'm just going to start listening to the videos with the sound on, and it not like to make a public disturbance, but rather just like you feign naivety, you feign innocence. This is my phone. I'm watching videos on my phone. Nobody can claim that that's criminal. But then people start looking, and there are so many videos. There's so many videos that if people saw, I'd like to think that if people were watching without the filter of Israeli media, then they would be more aware. Maybe in Israel not, maybe this would work in other places where people are less desensitized. But that's the most I can do right now, and I'm spreading that message around in hopes that, maybe that's something we can do because people are being deported for speaking out. And I thought, if you organize with 2 or 3 friends at different bus stops and you go together but stand separately, not all together like you're doing this on purpose, suddenly everybody's playing the same video of a mother crying or people weeping. And I know it's using their pain, but I'm kind of done like pretending like they aren't doing this for us. They're filming their pain. They're taking the time to film the last minutes of their lives. We're going to use that. I think we have to.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you for sharing that. Alex, maybe you can comment on civil disobedience and civil resistance and where you see that in terms of both its connection with international humanitarian law and how it empowers it, and also in terms of political expedience.
Yeah, and Moore's point, I think I'm always struck by a quote from Masha Gessen. She's talking about, that when you weigh your individual safety, or your kids or people that you care for, against the risk of speaking out, it's a lot easier to do nothing, to stay silent. But that if everybody does that, if everybody chooses their own individual safety over speaking out, then cumulatively, that's how you end up in a very bad fascistic place. She was writing about Russia, but it applies to any authoritarian case. But yeah, so doing something like watching a video, sharing a video, I really believe that that's the way that cumulatively all of us can make a difference. Writing an op-ed, just doing some small things. You're welcome, more. And yeah, through doing those small acts. I'd be curious to know if more or if anybody knows. It seems to me that weirdly the Israeli media can be a lot more honest about things that are happening. They Haaretz just wrote a article. I know not everybody reads Haaretz because it's considered left in Israel. Talking about how on the day that Israel broke the ceasefire, they committed the largest massacre of children in Israel's history. That sort of headline would never be seen in the United States. It would be considered far too inflammatory. People would lose their jobs. So it's a really strange dichotomy where it seems like in Israel, the reporting is more accurate and more upfront, and yet it's not making a difference in terms of making it stop or making people upset and making people want to save Palestinian lives. Whereas in the US, our media coverage is really awful and not very accurate and obscures. It's like it's become the job of journalists to obscure the truth. Um, and yet a lot of Americans do care about it. I guess it's the influence of social media breaking that barrier of not having to get all your information through news. But I just think that's a strange dichotomy.
Well, I
Well,
hate to
do you want me to
interrupt, but
rebuttal? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, go ahead more. Go ahead more. We'll give you the last comment before I close up things.
Sure. I was just going to say that the marketing surrounding our own deification, our own glorification, and where we stand, both biblically and politically, and the dehumanization on the other end of that spectrum, and the desensitization to Palestinians is working excellently. It's working exactly how Israel wants it to work. And from my personal being aware of the conflict the last 5 years and kind of observing from the side, I think the trigger words that turn people's minds off to question anything still work very, very well. So that if you say counterterrorism, self-defense, security, terrorist, nobody asks any questions. And then you're the idiot for asking or for doubting the IDF spokespeople. So even just talking to, you asked what happened since Haaretz, um, they do very, very detailed work and they expose things. So Haaretz is known as a leftist, and the leftists are breaking down the country. We're traitors, or in biblical terms, we're Erev Rav. So we're the people that can't be listened to. And these taglines, they work. My sister is learning paramedic, and she still believes that, you know, everything is being taken out of context. All the videos are taken out of context. So that's where we're at right now.
Thank you, Mo.
Good insight.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Alex, this has been a wonderful hour and 15 minutes. We're over our time limit, but who's counting? Um, and it's sobering. We've done our best. You've done your best to leave an optimistic note. It's a pretty dire situation, but we have to try. We can't give up. Today, in the United States is a national day of protest. And unfortunately, just as in Israel, there have been massive protests against the Netanyahu government. Um, they have not had much to do with support of Palestinians. They've had to do with opposition to Netanyahu. And the same thing is going to happen here today. It's people who are angry because their 401ks are going down the toilet, not because we've been participating in a genocide for the last 19 months, 18 months. And so what I say is, let's go out there and demonstrate along with everybody else. Let's make sure that everybody else, when they see us, know why we're demonstrating. And that's my words of wisdom for the day. Again, thank you, Alex, and I wish you the best. And we'll be hearing more from you, I'm sure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
And thank everybody for joining in today, because I know some of you are itching to get out there and join your local protest. So get out there and show them what we're there for.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Alex. We will
Thank
make
you.
the recording available on our website as soon as we can, jvphealth.org/events. And stay tuned also on our website for the next webinar.
Thank you.